Hey, welcome back to our online lecture series here in Ag Finance. This is Unit 8, and we've moved in kind of the final segments of our class where we talk about a lot of the management structural things and decision-making stuff that we might have to do, kind of with an overarching picture now of your total operation. Unit 8 focuses on farm business organization and transfer, and obviously this one gets into some really interesting discussions on how your farm is structurally managed and who makes the decisions. Recommended reading here is chapter 14. Let's get into our content, but I believe we're going to break this up into a 3-segment lecture so they don't get too long here on us. Obviously, you all can read the objectives. We're going to talk about the options that we have with regard to farm business organization. And then as we get to the end of the lecture, we'll talk about transferring that farm business from one generation to the next. An underlying theme of this whole particular lecture is going to be taxation and how it affects the farm business and what you can do from that standpoint, and liability as well. But let's introduce this stuff and kind of get to our content here. When we look at farm business organizations, they're typically in one of 3 ways. Number one, a sole proprietorship, meaning a single entity owns, a single person owns and operates that farm business, or a partnership where you have obviously more than one person involved in operating that business, or a corporation. And there's a few different models of that as well that we'll get to later. Each one has some different legal and organizational characteristics as well as tax implications, and we will talk about those as we go through here. A few other key informational items is more than 90% of U.S. farms are sole proprietorships. That's important. There seems to be this kind of thought process that farming is becoming much more corporate, and the data doesn't necessarily support that 100%. Still 90% and well over 90% are sole proprietorships. About 6% in partnerships and 3% in corporations, and of that subset, limited liability companies are a fast-growing piece of the corporate structure. And just a few in terms of farms are cooperatives, and we'll talk briefly about them as well. So really, how do you decide what your organizational structure, should be? Some of it is, of course, influenced by size. The larger the farm business, there are some potential advantages to going to a different organizational structure, but it's not required that way. Occasionally, the number of people involved helps maybe influence what your organizational structure should be. Career stage and age of the primary operator certainly can have some influence on what organizational structure is helpful. And then the owner's desire to pass their asset on to heirs or partners of the operation that aren't necessarily family. So what is their goal there? Instead of maybe just lining up the equipment and having an auction and selling your land and completely liquidating out of the business. Is there a business to pass on that you want to? Now, your textbook gives this time frame of a typical farm lifestyle, or life cycle, and notice there's no number of years at the bottom. It's all considered equal, which we know that isn't true because those vertical lines could slide left or right at any point in time. But we typically see a farm life cycle as some entry phase where you're just kind of getting started in the business. Then a growth phase where you're potentially adding acres or adding cattle or whatever it might be, that you're growing the operation actively. And that upward trend of the curve could go for quite a long time if you wanted it to. You see some farm businesses that grow for many, many years and decades long. And then you tend to reach a point where the farm business starts to begin to consolidate resources a little bit and then capture some efficiencies that maybe they've identified that have hindered their continual growth. And then there generally is a point in time where the farm business begins to exit the operation and looks towards the end of the operation's life cycle and liquidating the assets. Again, no definite time frame on each and any one of those, but important to recognize the life cycle. Again, the entry phase, choosing the farm, selecting the enterprises, acquiring, organizing resources, etc., and developing your financial base is kind of what they identify as that entry phase. The growth phase, expansion, maybe more intensified production, maybe merging or buying out other operations. Consolidation, we start to see some debt reduction as become a priority, and efficiency preferred to size. And then lastly, the exit phase, like we mentioned, liquidation, transfer to the next generation. Maybe you're begin to lose size for some particular reason. So you have to consider children who are or are not involved in the operation, what you're going to do with the assets that you have. So let's talk about a few of these organizational structures, and it's important that we first talk about sole proprietorships. Again, they're the number one farm business organization setup. From an organizational and characteristic standpoint, we'll try and do this with all of the structures. Is the owner, you're the owner operator, you manage your own business. And that means you assume all the risk, of course. The benefit of that is you also receive all the profits and losses without having to pay anything to anyone else or even report it to anyone else in terms of what you do. So you're solely responsible for the success and or failure of the operation. You're going to organize your resources and provide all the management, service all the debts. So this is that typical classical American family farm setup, a sole proprietorship. There's no legal limits, no procedures, and no licenses even required unless there's something specific for production from a marketing perspective that you might need, like organic, think something like that. There's no limitation in size. Your farm business could be as large as you wanted it to be or as small as you wanted it to be, dependent upon your desire. You can have employees or you can have nobody. You can own all the assets. You can lease them, whatever that you like. From an income tax perspective, I mentioned that we'll talk about that greatly through here, is you're going to pay all taxes at the individual tax rate. We'll talk a lot about taxation as we get to the assignment that's going to come with this particular section, but I'll encourage you to understand and know what the tax rate is. What is your tax responsibility? Business profits, capital gains, all taxable income is all going to be added together. And then it's important for you to understand and know what your tax responsibility is to the government. You're also going to be subject to self-employment tax and Medicare tax, things that the government collects because of government programs that they have. I have an additional set of videos that I will add into this section that will help you understand the FICA tax requirements and how to break those apart and how the government sees your dollars, because every dollar isn't necessarily the same dollar in the government's eyes. It's interesting to talk about, and we'll see that in a later video. Again, advantages of a sole proprietorship is it's simple and you have tons of freedom. You can do whatever that you want. You get all of the profits. It's very flexible. You can move assets anytime that you like, so you don't have to really consult anyone. You can make decisions as you see fit as a sole proprietor. Disadvantages is anything that is a responsibility or a liability is yours and yours alone. All legal challenges. So if you have a visitor to the farm who falls and breaks their leg and decides to sue you, you are legally responsible and liable for that. You are legally responsible and liable for all debts that you enter into. And that liability and legal responsibility stretches to your personal assets as well. There's no protection in that regard. So you're solely responsible for all the losses that happen. If you happen to get into trouble from a debt perspective, creditors come after you, business and personal assets. There's very little protection for you. And so it's limited sometimes, these things by the financial capability and capital that the owner can come up with. So as things get more efficient, sometimes sole proprietorships struggle because it's hard for them to be as efficient as maybe different operational structures are. And occasionally there's lack of business continuity. Bringing an heir into the business is difficult. There has to be a lot of planning that goes into that, because moving the business from one generation to the next isn't very seamless all the time. So sometimes it requires liquidation of the farm business, which is sad, or major reorganization. And those are all very difficult things that require a lot of legal and tax planning. So that's a sole proprietorship. we're going to start jumping into joint ventures, and we'll only get through, I believe, partnerships before we'll conclude this first segment video. But we're talking about combining abilities and assets to achieve some kind of efficiency or goal that might be attainable otherwise. And there's 5 different joint ventures listed here. But we're going to first start into partnerships and operating agreements. An operating agreement is very actually informal. You might not have to have anything on paper with regard to an operating agreement because you're really keeping everything separate. Think of this, for example, as you and a neighboring producer may choose to go together and buy your own feed mixer, or both of you buy a feed mixer together. You neither one have enough requirement to own your own feed mixer, but you think you can make it happen where one feed mixer will serve both operations. You could create an operating agreement in order to buy that feed mixer and use it at both operations, share the cost of expenses, share the other inputs and the service that's required on it, and you're also sharing what it does for you. Obviously, that sounds a little bit cumbersome, and it is occasionally, but that's a way to utilize an operating agreement. It's difficult when you talk about then budgeting that in whenever we start to bring those things into play is, whose balance sheet does that appear on and what proportion of it and who pays the expenses and where do those occur on the budget lines and so forth. So those are a little bit more difficult, and you don't see maybe a ton of these, but occasionally this is a way to split some expense between 2 different operations. And here's a good example for that in a beef operation is maybe you're splitting the cost somewhere along the line of pasture or feeding expense or something of that nature. So we'll bring this first segment in for a landing, as I don't want to get this too long. As we come back, we're going to talk about partnerships in more detail in segment 2. Thanks for tuning in.